When you picture the Palace of Versailles, you probably imagine glittering chandeliers, elegant nobles in silk gowns, and the epitome of refined civilization. The reality? It was quite literally a cesspool of human waste, filth, and smells so overwhelming that even the aristocrats couldn't escape them. Today, we're pulling back the perfumed curtain on royal life to reveal just how disgusting things really were behind the Golden Gates. Let's start with the most shocking fact about Versailles. The most magnificent palace in Europe, home to the Sun King himself, had absolutely no bathrooms. None. Zero. We're talking about a palace with over 700 rooms at its peak, housing thousands of courtiers, servants, and nobles, and not a single proper toilet among them. Louis XIV, the king who spent fortunes creating elaborate fountains and stunning gardens, apparently never thought to install a basic sewage system. So what did people do when nature called? Well, they got creative, and by creative, I mean absolutely revolting. Courtiers would relieve themselves anywhere they could find a private corner. Behind curtains, in hallways, on staircases, even in the fireplaces. The palace corridors became open-air urinals. Nobles would simply lift their elaborate gowns and do their business right there against the wall. Some carried portable toilet chairs that servants would empty, but most couldn't be bothered with such inconveniences. The gardens of Versailles, those beautiful, manicured landscapes that tourists flock to today, served as giant outdoor bathrooms. Visitors and courtiers alike would step behind hedges and statues to relieve themselves. The smell during summer months must have been absolutely unbearable. In fact, it got so bad that Louis XIV himself issued multiple ordinances begging people to stop defecating in the hallways and gardens. Did it work? Not really. When you have thousands of people and nowhere for them to go, royal decrees can only accomplish so much. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The nobles at Versailles were obsessed with appearance and status, right? They wore the finest clothes, the most elaborate wigs, and literally spent hours getting dressed each morning. But bathing? That was considered dangerous and unhealthy. The prevailing medical theory of the time held that water opened your pores and let in diseases. So instead of washing, aristocrats would simply change their linen undergarments and douse themselves in perfume. Lots and lots of perfume. This is actually why perfume became such a massive industry in France. It wasn't about smelling nice as an enhancement. It was about covering up the overwhelming stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste that permeated every corner of the palace. The French perfume industry literally built its fortune on the fact that rich people refused to bathe. Marie Antoinette, famous for her extravagance, might have bathed once a month if she was feeling particularly hygienic. The situation with clothing was equally disturbing. Those gorgeous silk gowns and velvet coats that we see in paintings? They were rarely, if ever, cleaned. The fabrics were too delicate and expensive to wash regularly, so people just wore the same outfits over and over, letting them accumulate sweat, food stains, and whatever else. The wealthy would have servants try to brush off the worst of the dirt, but that was about it. Imagine wearing the same formal outfit every day for months without washing it. Now imagine everyone around you doing the same thing. And let's talk about the wigs. Oh, the wigs. Those towering, elaborate hairstyles weren't just fashion statements. They were breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and other parasites. Women would build these massive structures on their heads using padding, wire frames, and their own hair mixed with horsehair, then coat the whole thing in powder and pomade. These creations would stay in place for weeks or even months. People would use special scratching sticks to try to relieve the itching without disturbing their hairstyle. Some wigs became so infested that mice would nest in them. The king himself wasn't exempt from these conditions. Louis XIV famously suffered from numerous health problems, many of which were directly related to the unsanitary conditions he lived in. He had dental problems so severe that a botched tooth extraction left a hole between his mouth and nose. He suffered from chronic digestive issues. Toward the end of his life, he had gangrene. And yet, he still rarely bathed, believing it was bad for his health. Now let's jump forward about 150 years to Victorian England. Surely things had improved by then, right? After all, This was the height of the British Empire, the age of industry and progress. Well, yes and no. The Victorians did start to understand hygiene better, but the reality of daily life, especially in cities, was still shockingly filthy. London in the Victorian era was the largest city in the world, and it was drowning in its own waste. The Thames River, which ran right through the heart of the city, was essentially an open sewer. All the waste from millions of people flowed directly into it. During the Great Stink of 1858, the smell became so unbearable that Parliament couldn't meet. They tried hanging sheets soaked in chloride of lime over the windows, but it didn't help. The stench was so powerful that lawmakers literally fled the building. The streets of Victorian London were coated in a mixture of mud, human waste, animal dung, and industrial pollution. Horses were the primary mode of transportation, and a single horse produces around 30 pounds of manure per day. Multiply that by the thousands of horses working in the city, and you can imagine the sheer volume of dung piling up everywhere. Dead animals were often just left to rot in the streets until someone got around to removing them. Victorian women's fashion was not just uncomfortable, it was genuinely dangerous and unsanitary. Those enormous crinolines and hoop skirts that made dresses balloon out? They were impossible to clean properly and would drag through all the filth on the streets. The skirts would soak up mud, animal waste, and whatever else was on the ground. Then women would bring all of that into their homes. Some estimates suggest that a woman's skirt could weigh an extra 10 pounds just from the accumulated street filth. The corsets that Victorian women wore were their own health hazard. Tight lacing, the practice of cinching corsets extremely tight to achieve an 18-inch waist, caused all sorts of medical problems. Women would faint regularly because they couldn't breathe properly. Their internal organs would be compressed and displaced. And because people still weren't bathing regularly, these corsets, which were worn directly against the skin, would become incredibly filthy and smelly. Victorian men weren't much better off. They wore multiple layers of wool clothing year-round, which they rarely washed. A typical gentleman would wear an undershirt, a regular shirt, a waistcoat, a jacket, and possibly an overcoat, all made of heavy fabrics that trapped heat and sweat. In an era before deodorant, you can imagine how pleasant this must have been. Let's talk about Victorian kitchens for a moment. Food safety regulations didn't exist. Milk was often watered down and contaminated with bacteria. Bread was sometimes bulked up with chalk or plaster. Candy was colored with toxic substances like lead and arsenic. Meat would be sold even when it was clearly spoiled, and butchers would use chemicals to mask the smell and color of rotten flesh. People got sick constantly, and many died from food poisoning that could have been easily prevented. The working-class neighborhoods of Victorian cities were even worse than anything we've discussed so far. Entire families would live in single rooms with no ventilation, no running water, and no sanitation facilities. Multiple families would share a single outdoor privy that was rarely emptied. The cesspits where waste was collected would overflow and leak into the water supply. Children played in streets that were literally running with sewage. But here's what's fascinating. Despite all of this disgusting reality, the Victorians were obsessed with the appearance of respectability and cleanliness. Middle and upper-class homes would have elaborate parlors that were kept spotless for receiving guests, even while the rest of the house might be fairly dirty. Women were expected to look pristine and pure, dressed in white or light-colored dresses that showed every speck of dirt, which was somehow supposed to prove that they didn't do any actual work. The Victorians developed this whole language of morality around cleanliness that didn't quite match up with reality. They believed that poverty and filth were signs of moral failing rather than understanding the systemic issues that created these conditions. The wealthy would talk about the great unwashed masses as if poor people chose to be dirty, completely ignoring the fact that working-class neighborhoods often didn't have access to clean water or proper sanitation facilities. Medical care during the Victorian era added its own element of horror to the mix. Doctors didn't understand germ theory for most of the period. They would go from performing autopsies on corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands. Surgical instruments weren't sterilized. Hospitals were often more dangerous than just staying home because infections spread so easily. Even Queen Victoria herself wasn't living in the pristine conditions you might imagine. Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace were certainly cleaner than Versailles had been, but they still had serious problems. The drains were inadequate, rooms were often damp and moldy. Prince Albert, Victoria's beloved husband, possibly died from typhoid fever contracted from the palace's faulty sewage system. The death of the prince consort from what was essentially a sanitation problem finally prompted some reforms in royal residences. The thing is, change did eventually come, but it was slow and uneven. The Victorians gradually figured out that maybe bathing was actually good for you. They started building proper sewer systems after disasters like the Great Stink made it impossible to ignore the problem anymore. Germ theory gained acceptance, and people began to understand how diseases actually spread. By the end of the Victorian era, things were genuinely improving, at least for those who could afford it. What's really striking when you look at both Versailles and Victorian society is how much effort people put into maintaining appearances while living in absolutely disgusting conditions. At Versailles, nobles would spend hours getting dressed in elaborate outfits and having their hair styled, then go relieve themselves behind a curtain in the hallway. Victorians would obsess over having the perfect parlor to receive guests while their streets literally ran with sewage. The gap between image and reality was enormous. This obsession with appearance over actual cleanliness tells us something interesting about both societies. Status and the performance of wealth were more important than comfort or health. It was better to suffer in a tight corset and dirty clothes that looked expensive than to be comfortable and actually clean. It was more important for Versailles to have elaborate fountains that barely worked than to have functional toilets. The priorities were completely backward from our modern perspective. The legacy of these filthy conditions shaped our modern world in ways we don't often think about. The perfume industry, as we mentioned, grew directly out of the need to cover up body odor at places like Versailles. The elaborate sewer systems under cities like London and Paris, which we now take for granted, were built in direct response to Victorian-era sanitation crises. Our modern obsession with cleanliness and hygiene is partly a reaction to how disgusting things used to be. It's also worth noting that not every culture was dealing with these same issues to the same degree. While Europeans were avoiding baths and throwing waste in the streets, many other societies around the world had much better hygiene practices. The Ottoman Empire had hammams, or public baths, that people used regularly. Japanese culture had a long tradition of bathing and cleanliness. The European approach to hygiene during these periods was actually kind of an outlier in human history. When you really think about it, the fact that anyone survived these conditions is pretty remarkable. Child mortality rates were astronomical. Diseases that we now consider minor could be death sentences. And yet, society functioned. People fell in love, created art, built empires, and lived their lives surrounded by filth that would send most of us running in horror today. The human capacity to normalize absolutely anything is pretty incredible. When everyone around you is living in filth, it just becomes normal. You develop social conventions and polite fictions to avoid acknowledging the reality. You convince yourself that bathing is actually unhealthy so you don't have to feel bad about not doing it. Modern people sometimes romanticize the past, wishing they could live in a grand palace or experience the elegance of the Victorian era. But the reality is that even the wealthiest people in history lived in conditions that we would find absolutely intolerable today.